Hi everybody, it's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. I'm so happy that you're here. We are diving into pediatric development and we are continuing our journey. And this week, what we're going to talk about is the birth process. Now, we got started really focusing on where our children are right now, the things that are impacting them, and how the CDC has changed the developmental milestones, which makes absolutely no sense because all we're doing then is giving it a stamp of approval if your child doesn't do something even longer past the time that they should do it. So these developmental milestones are windows of development for our children. And during that time, there is all different kinds of things happening in the brain, all kinds of neurology going on. And they are meant to have a period of time. And during that period of time, there's supposed to be all of the work being done, making the connections, growing more networks to ultimately allow that child to move from being brainstem dominant in the lower brain to allowing the higher brain to take over for executive function. So we're really breaking that down so that we understand what developmental delay is, because it actually has many, many names. It is not just autism. It is not just Asperger. It is ADD, ADHD, OCD, ODD, PDD, and I always like to say LMNOP. I don't really care what label you give it. In 26 years of looking at children like I have, my histories have literally demonstrated these blueprints and shown the red flags where there might have been some interruptions. And we highlighted some things about what might cause an interruption, and it can be something that literally is in the foundation of how the baby even came to be in both mom and dad. It can be the state of health during pregnancy. It can be the level of stress, and the last 2 years it's been a lot of stress, and it can be how we took care of ourselves, what information we got and how we applied it. That literally could be some misinformation about how things actually get wired. Because in traditional healthcare, in many pediatricians' office, they might tell you it doesn't matter if your child crawls. It doesn't matter when your child stands up and walks. And I'm going to tell you right now, that is completely not true. I have seen thousands of children. I have looked at their histories. I have been able to see the things that they were able to do timely and for the expected amount of time. And there are totally different outcomes when a child is able to go through developmental progression as expected as compared to a child that goes through many interruptions. So we're kind of walking backwards to see how different things impact. Last week I did it on stress. This week is literally about the birth process, because that is so important for us to understand how many things are going on. So the first thing I want to do is I want to describe what an ideal situation would be for a baby to come into this world. And I want to preface it because in our traditional healthcare model, pregnancy is actually in the codes as a disease. So it's looked at that it can only be handled in the medical model and nothing else can possibly happen. I'm coming from an experience that my first ended up in a C-section, and looking back, I can honestly tell you that simply was because I was ignorant. I did not understand this process. And I'm going to describe a couple of pieces about that when we get to that section. But my second child was a home delivery after a C-section. And even though there might have been some other stressors in the equation, there's a completely different process that both of them got to experience. And so just from my own personal experience, I wanted to understand and know more. And now this is what I do, so of course I want to know even more, but there are ideal situations. Now, let's also preface this. There is a place for a cesarean section. I'll refer to it from now on as a C-section, but it can absolutely be the right way to go in an emergency situation. So this podcast is not meant to say that all C-sections are terrible. I had one, okay? But we now look at this idea of it being elected, and I'm really going to get into some stats I find very alarming, but we're going to look at some stats as well that show us, especially where the United States falls with this percentage of people that go into an elected C-section and what the outcome is, okay? So there is no judgment. It's really just about trying to build some information. If you happen to be in a situation that you're either planning on having a baby or you're getting ready to have a baby and you've already decided to have an elected C-section, maybe you'll rethink it, okay? All right, so let's dive in. What goes on for that baby? And I'm really going to spend a lot of time from the baby's perspective. So around 7.5 months of pregnancy, the baby is literally going to begin its flip and get its head downward. Now, prior to that, the head being up. So there is a law called Wolff's Law that bone is going to grow wherever the stress is. So gravity is coming downward, and so the baby's head being upward is we're going to get ossification or development of the cranial plates of the head. Now we've got to get the pelvis. So around 7.5 months, that's when the baby turns. And so the baby's head starts its descent as early as 7.5 months. The pelvis is up here now, and so we're going to get those bony ossification centers growing in the pelvis so that the baby has stability when it arrives, okay? And then when labor starts, it is literally generated by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so now let's connect some dots. We've talked a lot about the sympathetic nervous system as it relates to the Moro reflex. You may know sympathetics to be called the fight or flight. So if you're just joining this podcast first, fight or flight is a response, but it's not the only thing that the sympathetic nervous system does. In fact, when you breathe in, that is the sympathetic nervous system. When you exhale, it is the parasympathetic nervous system. And the two together are called the autonomic nervous system, okay? So we'll refer to it as fight or flight and for sympathetics, and we will refer to it as rest, feed, and breed for parasympathetics, but these are very active parts of our neurology. Now, because of the reflex system, Moro, which started back in the 9th week of pregnancy, is highly involved. Remember what elements Moro is going to regulate. Arousal, which is going to go to the sleep-wake cycle, which then we attend to the baby. We teach the baby to attend to self, and then the toddler school age begins to attend to others. And this is my connection back to all the attention deficit that exists in our world today. It also is what is about the CO2-O2 reflex, making sure that there is always enough oxygen available. So it's got to be a reflex. We want that baby to survive, right? The third component is the sympathetic nervous system. So that thing's been going since 9 weeks of pregnancy. Okay, I got to grab a drink of water. So it's highly involved. Now, we want to keep those pieces in mind because they are about building the neurology. And these reflexes really need a vaginal delivery because that's where they are going to finish what they're doing. So if we go by a C-section, we've now just interrupted the trajectory of those primitive reflexes. So as we were talking about before, the interruptions, it literally can be the birth process itself that could lead to an interruption that could change the development of that child. Also, because of the Moro and the sympathetic / fight or flight, if mom is in chronic stress, she can actually rob cortisol from her baby through the umbilical cord while that baby is still in the womb. So this, to me, is a main reason why I'm very big on planning and really finding out your state of health before you conceive that baby. So we're moving along. Babies are descending down into the pelvis. That sympathetic / fight or flight mechanism is actually going to behave in a completely different way, and it will never act like this again. Instead of the sympathetics revving everything up, it actually slows everything down in order for that baby to go through the transition of birth. And I'd like to underline that word transition because that's one of the key elements associated with the Moro reflex is someone not handling change very well, not able to make a transition from one stage, state, place, or another. So that's a key word. So everything is going to slow down at this time. Now, in that descent, even beginning at 7.5 months, the cranial system, we know what the borders are in between each plate. They're called sutures. And those sutures are open. And you may have heard of this as the baby's soft spot. But those sutures are everywhere on the cranial head system, as well as internally. So it's not just on the outside, it's literally all of the bones of the skull have not yet solidified. And they'll never really completely solidify because the cranial system actually has a rhythm and it has its own respiration cycle, and it literally is the pumping mechanism to the cerebral spinal fluid that goes from the brain all the way down the cord. So it's a very important system, but it's very malleable at birth. So as that baby is coming down the birth canal, you're going to take an average 15 centimeter head and you're literally going to squish it down to 10. Now, last time I told you about birth that right when all this is happening, the neck is also getting stacked up. And so the baby's head kind of tilts forward And the top of the head, or the circumference of the head, is meant to match the pelvic outlet of the mother. So innate has its beautiful rhythm of creating a concert between mom and baby to be a duet when a baby is being born. Now, I always refer to the big squeeze on the brain when the cranial vault is coming from 15 to 10 centimeters. And I really believe that this is the internal switch for the baby, that you're getting ready to go live in the outside world. And things are going to rapidly change once that baby is born. So as soon as the head, this is why it's so important for the head to come out first. But when the head comes out, literally it's like a springboard, and all the cranial plates move back into their position, resuming their 15 centimeter posture or size. So this physiological change is necessary for the physiology of the baby to know innately, what am I supposed to do next? So now we've got the head out, we've got to get the broad shoulders out. So what a baby will do is a baby will turn its head, and that arm will reflexively go out, as well as the leg. This is another reflex called the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. And we'll talk about reflexes in more detail down the road. But this is literally how the baby is going to pull its shoulder underneath the mother's pubic bone. Then it will come back to neutral, and it will repeat it to the other side. So remember what I was talking about. These reflexes have to finish their scenario. They're all still part not only of what was going on in the womb, but the birth process in and of itself, and not just the process for getting here, but telling that baby its own neurology. Now we're getting ready to move forward. Now, once both shoulders are out, now the pubic bone, baby's faces are face down, and the pubic bone of mom is literally going to ride alongside the spine. And literally the baby's legs are drawing up, and literally by the time it gets all the way down to the sacrum, the baby is going to toe off, and it will urinate, because that's spinal gallant reflex. And it does this innately to get the byproduct of pregnancy out. Now, the next day or so is when we get the notorious first bowel movement that never looks like that ever again, because it is meconium and it is the byproduct of pregnancy. So we look at the elimination systems. We urinate and we defecate. So we're getting that byproduct out. So we're getting ready to start our life in the world. Now, when they take a baby out, they are going to lay the baby on top of the mother's left breast. And the baby's right side is going to be down on the mother's body. And the reason they do this is because there is the foramen ovale, which is literally a hole that exists between the two top chambers, the atrium of the baby's heart. The baby has not been oxygenating its own system yet. Mom's been doing it for them. So now the baby's got to be able to do it for itself. So when they put the baby down on the right side, it literally is creating a pressure gradient. And inside that baby, I often think about how fast this is going on, that it is laying down all these fibers in order to close the hole. And now that pressure is building up in the right atrium, which is literally going to open up the mitral valve and put it into the baby's right ventricle. And now the baby's own system is getting primed to oxygenate its own blood. Meanwhile, we're stimulating that liver because we're laying down on that right side, And now the baby's whole body is getting involved into the transition of life. And the way we can monitor this process is if you leave the cord has a pulse. And when the pulse stops, that is the baby's signal, I'm ready. Now, I can tell you from my second delivery that happened, but it did not happen in my first. And I haven't met very many people that had the opportunity to even have that one element of allowing the baby to have its transition like it should have, so that we could have a much higher probability of a positive outcome. Okay, so that is an ideal situation. The other side of the coin is a C-section delivery. Why do we do this? Well, there's two sides. There's the side of the mother, father, and then there's the side of the medical community. Now, I want you to know, I am not a medical basher. That is not the reason I bring these things up. But they are things that happen. And so you have to be aware of them so that you can be your best own advocate. So there's a medical view of pregnancy, like I mentioned earlier. It is literally listed as a disease based on its code for billing purposes to insurance companies. And you may have different medical situations where they're going to protect themselves first, and they are going to ensure that you have a safe outcome, because there has been so much litigation over time that even certain states have literally pulled out of obstetrics because the chances of being sued are so high, which I also think is very unsettling, that this is the way that we would handle any of our affairs all the time. There's reasons for mom too. Mom might be fearful of pain, fearful of the unknown. And so she may go with a C-section because she just feels like there's going to be less pain. There'll be lots of medication and she doesn't really have to feel it. There's a convenience factor. There can be a convenience factor for the medical provider, and there can also be a convenience factor for the parents that are involved. There's also people that actually believe that having a C-section is better for the baby. And I'm hoping after today that I can definitely dispel that belief system. So I want to share with you, I have some stats pulled up, so you'll see me look over here. So what's estimated is that we should try to keep our C-section rate between about 10 to 15%. So what I want to show you or tell you is where the percentage lies, and I'll highlight a couple of countries underneath all these different stats. So for example, 46 to 57% of babies being prepared to be born are going to go with an elected C-section in the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and China. 35 to 45% is Mexico, Chile, Maldives, Uruguay, Georgia, Republic of Korea, Romania, Italy, Hungary, Portugal. 30 to 45%, Poland, Malta, Bulgaria, Paraguay, Australia, the United States of America, 32.2%. Switzerland, Germany, Albania. And then the list goes on. I at least wanted to get to the United States. So why do we do this? Well, the reasons I've just said. A lot of it is convenience, and a lot of it is maybe some beliefs and some fears. But let's really talk about what is the risk to the baby. And I think you might find this quite interesting. So number one risk to a baby in having a C-section is the potential of trauma. A woman is going to be cut open. Her uterus is going to be cut open, and that baby is right in there. So there is a risk of trauma to the baby. Number two, which I think is really big, is the prematurity factor, okay? Your baby's brain at around 35 weeks weighs about 2/3 of the weight that it will eventually reach. By weeks 39 to 40, that weight is going to increase to what we expect it to be at delivery. That's huge, okay? So it's greatly reduced the earlier you go. So that must mean, and it does, that there is a lot of activity that is going on right before delivery. And a lot is already known about the lungs, but I wonder how many people realize that just the weight of the brain was going to change substantially within a few weeks from 35 to 39. Most babies with elected C-sections are taken somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks early. And that's if the math is impeccable in trying to figure out when conception actually occurred. And there's a lot of differences that go on in trying to evaluate when did I actually conceive this baby. So even though we might think we're in our 37th, 38th week, we might in fact only be in our 36th. So we're going to get to respiration now. So by the time your baby is born, there's a lot of fluid in the lungs. And this is actually changing quite a bit the last 2 weeks of pregnancy. So if we elect to have a C-section, we're interrupting surfactant, which is what's going to allow the baby to exchange oxygen for itself, exchange it for carbon dioxide for itself, as well as if they don't go through the actual labor part, where there's a lot of tootsie rolling, squeezing, and pushing down from the top of the uterus, then we're not going to push that fluid out of the lungs, and that can lead to some other issues. So one issue is persistent pulmonary hypertension. C-section babies are 4 times at a greater risk of having pulmonary hypertension than a baby born vaginally. So at birth, the blood vessels in the lungs are meant to relax. So remember what I told you about Moro and sympathetic / fight or flight. This is when this part of your autonomic nervous system is going to work entirely differently. So now we can see it projecting into the blood vessels, which literally is going to then allow the blood to flow moments after birth. So from the typical delivery and the laying down on the side and the building up of pressure to open up the valve for the baby to begin its own oxygenation, there has to be this toning down of the system, and that is a neurological function. This is what is allowing the exchange of the carbon dioxide for oxygen. If this doesn't happen, blood flow, then the baby's blood pressure is actually going to go up. And babies with persistent pulmonary hypertension have very low blood oxygen levels and can suffer from brain damage and organ damage. Now, you might say some of these pieces match what your baby went through, but your baby never got diagnosed with pulmonary hypertension, and that's great. But when I get to, especially in a podcast where we're talking about the immune load on a child has been really linked with development that has not gone in an expected direction. I also want you to understand that we don't have to have every little thing that's listed in a diagnosis in order to pay attention to it. So if anybody's been telling you that your baby's blood pressure is a little high or your baby's oxygen level is a little low, and it matches that you had a C-section, I think that's something that you should pay attention to, because I don't want them to have a diagnosis, but you can have mild issues that can have very long-reaching effects in the lifetime of your child. I've seen in different research articles where different characteristics were described that based on maybe their level of severity or the timing indicated if the situation was right away or if it didn't manifest later in that child's development. And I've seen that in practice as well. So I want you to connect as many dots as you possibly can, because when we can get to babies and children early and don't wait to see if they grow out of everything, we have a much higher chance of changing the outcome. And that's what's important. Okay, so let's continue. The next one is called wet lungs. And that's again where we have all this fluid in the lungs and it's not getting pushed out. This can actually lead to an increased risk in the respiratory rate of a baby, which then may require oxygen support, which then may lead to the use of antibiotics from a preventable model, because the longer the fluid stays around, there's a higher risk of infection. That's been the same model looking at children with ear infections and why they've constantly been given antibiotics, even though most of those infections are viral, not bacterial. And so some of these things that I'm going to talk about with the antibiotic use and how it impacts the gut, it's the same thing with an ear infection. So if we're gonna put an antibiotic in a child, and again, I'm not against antibiotics, but antibiotics have such a great way of supporting somebody with a bacterial infection if you know what bacteria you're actually trying to kill. And then if the antibiotic was put together to only address that bacteria, but that's not what we do. We give broad spectrum everything. And so when you give broad spectrum antibiotics, it wipes out all the good guys as well as the bad guys. Now, when you are a baby, you don't really have any good guys yet. If you're a C-section, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, you also are running the risk of not getting exposed to mom's good bacteria, which is the way your baby begins its immune system. And this is so well known now that there are some doctors that are allowing their medical team in that moment to take some fluid from mom and literally rub it all over the baby so that they get the good bacteria. And it doesn't go on everywhere, but it's a start. But electing to have a C-section for the wrong reason, there's a lot of outcome to your baby that is not positive. So it is really important to take a look at this. Even infant death. A study went on in 2006 that literally looked at babies born via C-section versus vaginal. And there was a 3-time risk increase of babies dying within the first month when there was an outcome of a elected, or using an outcome as an elected C-section for your baby's delivery. Now, you know, I listen to this stuff, and especially if you are a mom and you're pregnant and you're listening, I just want to tell you, my goal is not to stress anybody out. But I also, has anybody ever talked to you about this stuff? And if you have no other option but a C-section, then let's let go of stress and take some of these pearls. Talk to your doctor about taking your bodily fluids from your birth canal and rubbing them all over your baby so that your baby has a chance to build its immune system. So there's lots of things, and especially if you have no other choice, this is where coming to somebody like me, this is the kind of stuff that I look at. I've taught all kinds of new mommies, okay, this is what we had to go through. There's no reason to look back. Let's go forward. Here's some things that we can do to give that baby the input it needed in order to have an expected development. And again, because the brain has neuroplasticity, and if we put the correct work in there, the neurology is like a domino. It will begin to push forward. So that's really what I want to focus on. Now, what about C-sections and immediate health? This is where you go back and you look at your child's APGAR score. So it's going to be done at 1 minute and at 5 minutes. And literally, APGAR is going to tell you how the baby arrived in the world and what does it look like in order for it to be given the highest score, okay? And the highest score would be 10. So A is for activity, P is for pulse. Now, I'm going to highlight that one. They've each got like either 0, there was no heart rate or pulse. 1 would be under 100 beats per minute. A 2 would be over 100 beats per minute because that's the expected blood pressure of a baby, or heart rate of a baby, okay? Heart rate, not blood pressure. Okay, grimace. How does it respond to a stimulus? Well, your baby's here. It should now be responding. And then appearance. Is it healthy color? Is it gray? Is it pink? And then the respiration rate. So if you are a new mommy, or you are a mommy that literally kept those kind of baby records, go back and look, what was your baby's score at 1 minute and 5 minutes? And that will let you know what kind of state your baby was in when they arrived to the world. Okay, long-term health coming from a C-section. Well, it really boils down to the development of that microbiome. But if you're a C-section baby, they have literally found that you have a much higher bacterial or toxic load than babies born by vaginal delivery. So it is very important for babies to come through that birth canal. They are going to finish what they started in the womb. They are going to finish their movement patterns. The reflexes are going to get the information that we're outside in the world. You can continue to do what you're going to do so that you can integrate in a timely manner. You're going to get the big squeeze on your brain. You're going to get stimulation to your organs. Your heart channels, or your heart pumps are going to be chambers. Your heart chambers are going to be driven in the right direction so that you can get the oxygen that you so desperately need for the power of life. The last thing that I want to mention on a C-section is the typical thing that happens in a C-section is mommies may just get to see their baby for a second, or they're on a screen, but they're whisked away because it's been a surgical procedure. They're going to be completely checked, and things are going to be monitored and things like that. So there's a separation. And what's literally supposed to be going on? Let's go back to that typical. The baby is supposed to be at the mom's left breast. There have been video after video that I have seen where literally that baby would begin to crawl on its own mother and go right to the breast and begin breastfeeding. That is a stimulation to the mother that it's time for us to make a shift inside. And this is what's going to tell the mother's brain that it's time for us to start producing milk so that we can feed our baby. You know, every part of the process of life just has a magnificent experience. And it's so interesting to me how uniquely it's been knitted together. And there's so much for us to still unfold, but we're learning so much more. And the birth process, I can tell you, I will find this to be one of the top 5 interruptions in children that are not developing as expected. They are now covered with some label. They may be on some psychotropic drug. They may not have friends. They may not be learning, which all of these things are so innate to the child. My passion, my goal is to help everyone understand this so that we can begin to look at the needs of our children from a different set of eyes. They so desperately need it. I've so enjoyed talking to you today. If you like the podcast, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you share it. Make sure that you take a pearl and you start weaving it into your own life right now. If you want to have a complimentary consultation with me over the phone, I want you to reach out. You can call the office, 678-501-5172. You can visit the website, connectmybrain.com, and send me a lead, and I will be happy to reach back out to you. I am very approachable. It's a very open door policy in my office because I'm not just caring for the child. I am caring for the family. These are your precious babies, and I am honored to be part of their lives. I hope you have a great evening or day wherever you are, and we'll see you next time on Dr. Laura at Connect My Brain.